Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be amongst you today. And I bring you greetings from one of your partners, a dead campaigner himself, Dr. Kent David Kaunda, the first Republican president of Zambia. Having been a member of parliament over the last 6 years, before which I worked with the donor community for more than a decade, and being closely associated with Jubilee Zambia, I have not only read, but I've seen firsthand the humanizing effects that death has had on the poor in my country. I have witnessed the pain of children dying of starvation from preventable diseases and without mother's love. I have seen children grow without education. I have watched children turn dungeons into their bedrooms and picking food from dustbins. My life has been associated with wailing mothers, daughters, and sisters burying their people who go to early graves due to lack of medical care, due to destitution. The majority of my fellow citizens live from day to day without hope for a future. They have suffered the pangs of hunger, disease, and ignorance for more than 5 decades that my country has suffered the burden of debt. Whereas my country's economy grew at an average of 4% per year and saved in excess of 30% of GDP from the Second World War to the early 1970s, its fortunes turned around after the oil crisis and the stagnation of copper prices in the mid to the late 1970s. Being a young country, having attained political independence only 6 years earlier, my government was in a hurry to educate its population. It was in a hurry to build clinics, hospitals, and infrastructure, and to provide safe drinking water and sanitation to its people. With a poorly performing economy, my country was forced into debt. Whatever little development was being recorded by Zambia during this period was threatened to be reversed by the colonial regimes that dominated Southern Africa. It was therefore imperative for Zambia to support the liberation struggles in our sister countries like Angola, Mozambique, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. To do so, my dear country again had to borrow from external sources, thereby more than doubling her debt burden. The phenomenal growth of Zambia's debt from 3.2 billion in 1980 to 6 billion in 1997, and finally 7.1 billion in 2002, was ironically due to accumulation of arrears, which my country failed to honor because of foreign exchange difficulties. As though they were a panacea to the unsustainable debt that my country and other poor countries had accumulated, creditor nations and the Bretton Woods institutions imposed various conditions such as privatization, wage freezes, downsizing of the civil service, introduction of user fees for primary health care and basic education, cancellation of government subsidies to water and sanitation, and so on. As we have now come to acknowledge, the results of these formulations have been reduced productivity, increased joblessness, deepened poverty, and even heavier debt. Under these circumstances, the attainment of the UN MDGs by countries such as my own are a far cry. As a parliamentarian from a debtor nation, I'm overjoyed by the initiative of members of the United States Congress who are sponsoring the Jubilee Act for Responsible Lending and expanded debt cancellation. During Sabbath year, there can be no better strategy for development and global peace and justice than the cancellation of all bilateral and multilateral debt, the enactment and enforcement of laws that protect the poorest of the poor of the world from irresponsible lending, ensuring that all creditor nations and institutions contribute to preserving the gains of debt relief and protecting debtor nations against private investors who attempt to profit from trading poor nations' debts. Zambia, like Tanzania, can well demonstrate that debt relief can reach the poor. The US $23.8 million savings from debt relief for my country is going into agriculture projects, eliminating of school fees and user fees in rural health care centers, and to infrastructure development. On the other hand, my country can also demonstrate that voucher funds can hurt and can reverse the gains, as we recently paid a colossal amount of $15 million to such a voucher fund in the name of Donegal. For the noble intentions of the Jubilee Act to have any meaningful effect, the other side of the equation ought to be put right. And the Zambian parliament is cognizant of the fact that our country has Two, has to engage in responsible borrowing and responsible utilization of borrowed and owned resources. To this effect, the Zambian Parliament over the last few years has been working on reforming the legal framework governing not only loan contraction processes, but also the management of the budget cycle. Since 1969, the government of Zambia has had the free hand to contract external internal debt without the approval of Parliament, as long as it fell within the ceiling provided by Parliament. The loans so acquired are managed by the Ministry of Finance and the Bank of Zambia at the exclusion of Parliament. This has made monitoring of debt and follow-up on its utilization very problematic. Against this background, from 2001, members of Parliament, particularly those in the Reforms and Modernization Committee, the Estimates of Budget Committee, and the Committee on Economic Affairs, which I'm privileged to chair, have been making frantic efforts to introduce the following pieces of legislation. One, the Budget Act. Two, the Government Borrowing Act, to provide for a transparent loan contraction process and to provide for Parliament to authorize any borrowing after considering the source of the loan, the extent of the total indebtedness by way of principal and interest, provision made for repayment of the loan, and its intended utilization. Three, the Access of Information Act. Four, the Code of Conduct of Public Officers legislation. And five, the Budget Monitoring Framework, to provide for the setting up of a unit involving civil society organizations and other interest groups to monitor the implementation of poverty reduction programs financed by the national budget. With the continued support of civil society organizations and the growing zeal of parliamentarians, we are certain that we shall deliver the laws that will make irresponsible borrowing and abuse of national resources a thing of the past. We are determined to stop corruption and its associated vices of bribery, nepotism, and plunder of the national economy. I appeal to all parliamentarians globally to exert pressure on our governments to deliver on the United Nations MDGs. In addition, I urge members of the United States Congress and the Senate to support the Jubilee Act on responsible borrowing and expanded debt cancellation. I appeal to the people of the great state of America to insist that the government of the United States of America takes the leading role in delivering, particularly on MDG number 8, which calls for building a global partnership for development, addressing the needs of least developed countries, developing an open trading and financial system, and dealing comprehensively with the debt of developing countries. May God bless you.